My first question is, has there ever been a hardware failure of the voting machines, a widespread hardware failure throughout on Election Day of the voting machines?
Not to my knowledge, and keep in mind, each one of these machines is a standalone machine, and state law does not permit networking of any form, either wireless or wired connectivity. So think of these machines as a photocopier or a scanner that's at a poll site. If you have 10 photocopiers in your office and one fails, that doesn't mean the other 9 are going to fail. So I think that's probably the easiest analogy, but then they also tabulate the results as well.
In your knowledge, is there any way for a potential bad actor, using your analogy, to get into said photocopier and be able to change the way it reads the ballots?
They don't have access to them, and in order to do that, they would have to have access to the machines, and our security protocols are such that they don't have access to them. So if you were going to talk about somebody on Election Day, they'd have to walk into a poll site with all the poll workers, with the other voters in the room, and then somehow access the machine and walk out undetected.
Where are the machines when it's not Election Day?
They're stored in we have warehouse facilities in the 5 boroughs, but we also have to follow the state rigorous testing system prior to deployment. So any time a machine leaves our facility for any reason, and prior to deployment for the next election, they have to be retested. And I would say that even with the scaled-down number of ballots that the state board has now said we can do on for an upcoming election event, we're putting a lot of wear and tear on the machines in the testing process, and I think rightfully so that we know when we're putting these machines out there that they're working properly, and when they're on functioning on Election Day, not only are they going to be available for the voters to put the ballot in, but then they're going to tabulate properly at the end of the night.
Now, changing course, if there is an actor who enters your database in the New York City Board of Elections and enters the voter rolls, what are the procedures to either catch that actor before he or she is able to in any way manipulate those rolls, and that if it's decided that that person has had ample time and access to the voter rolls to possibly manipulate, what backups do you have to ensure that you can go back to a time period that you know for certain that that actor had not been entering the rolls, to be able to cross-reference them to make sure that folks who are registered and are enrolled in a specific party stay registered and stay enrolled?
Right. So first of all, we're not aware of any such activity happening with respect to the Board of Elections in the City of New York. Secondly, we have our own internal firewall protocols that we have, and we have our own unit in MIS. We have our own, I shouldn't say employees within our MIS unit that constantly monitor any external activity. The way that it's been described to me, was my analogy, was if you're playing handball, right, and you hit the ball up against the wall, you could see the mark on the wall. That doesn't mean that the ball went through the wall and got in. It just means that it tried. So that kind of activity is going on an ongoing basis. And in addition to that, we now have the overlay of 24-hour a day, 365-day a year protection from Mandiant, which is the vendor that was provided by the City of New York. And as I said, they clock 100,000 hours of monitoring activity per year. So they are certainly much more expert than probably us or any other government entity in watching these things to make sure nobody's getting in. And the other way that it's been described to me, and I'll explain it the way I explained it last year, is if you're going to accept visitors at your home, you have to have a number on your house, right? That's your IP address. Right? So if you want anybody to come to your website and be able to access your information, you have to give them a public-facing IP address. So much in the same way that you can't stop somebody from knocking on the front door of your house if they want to sell you a magazine. They don't do that anymore, but you know what I'm saying, right? You can deny them entry, and you can deny them entry by having a proper lock on your door. You could have denied them entry by having a appropriate security system. That is cybersecurity in a nutshell. You got to let them know where your address is. You got to let them know where you are, but you have to have the proper protocols in place to deny them entry. And we believe that as much of a state-of-the-art as a government entity can be, we are right now, and we're adequately protected based on the known threats. The question with this always is, what's the next threat that's coming that's unknown? And, you know, we have to rely on experts to tell us what that is.
But Commissioner Ryan, that's not my question. So, right, yes, I have a lock on my door. I would like to deny a robber entry to my home. But of course, no matter how well protected my home is, sometimes they do gain entry. And my question is, if that were to happen, if a bad actor were to gain entry to your systems and to manipulate the voting rolls, what is your procedure to make sure that we have integrity in our voting lists?
I'm sorry, I missed that piece of it. We back up on a regular basis, off-site, and as well, we transmit daily to the State Board of Elections, and they also back up. So between those two systems, we could go back to a date certain and say, okay, we're going to start over from here. Now, you had mentioned earlier, Assemblyman, the issues with Brooklyn and the voter rolls. And I want to go back to that point because that was a dark day for us. But it didn't last more than a month. So I want to be clear about that. We restored all of those voters. But that happened in advance of the presidential primary. We only had about 140 people who were of that 117,656 that actually voted by affidavit ballot. So the net effect wasn't as broad as was reported. But by June the 6th of 2016, all of those voters were restored to the voter rolls. So that was a technical interpretation of a rule, not a technology problem. But that was the dark day. The cloud that was lifted was, prior to that, we were communicating our information back and forth with the State Board of Elections. And the process that you would hear probably the state folks call an audit, we would call it a resync, was happening on a relatively haphazard basis. Keep in mind, though, that the process of sharing this information is still relatively new. I think the City Board of Elections went online fully in the early part of 2013 or maybe the latter part of 2012. So now push forward, 3 years later, we're in 2016 and there was some growing pains. What made I'll call the Brooklyn problem look worse was we sent data up, a lot of data, prior to the November reporting time for the State Board of Elections to release its full lists. A lot of that data did not get communicated to the state. It got hung up in between the two systems. So what happened was the Brooklyn issue occurred then in July, right? We had data that got hung up prior to the November date, and then a resync occurred in February of 2016. So all that data hits now all at once, and it took that Brooklyn problem and exacerbated it, made it look like it was much worse than it actually was. So we looked at everything. And when I say we, I mean the city board and the state board collectively put our heads together and said, hey, how are we going to make this? This has to get better. Our problem that we created revealed a larger problem about this communication issue. So we put our heads together, and our tech folks and the state tech folks fixed the problem. And so what happens now is our folks took this resyncing process that used to take 66 to 72 hours, and broke it up from one monolithic beginning to end process into about 8 or 9 different processes that can run simultaneously. So we can fully audit our own system every weekend, which we do. And then we resync on a weekly basis with the State Board, in addition to giving them information daily. We've seen the discrepancies go down to the single digits. And when you're talking about we transmit 5 million records to the State Board when we make our transmissions, well, you say, well, if you only have 10,000 changes, why do you submit 5 million records? Exactly for the reason that you discussed, is how do you go back to that point in time? So we're sending a full file every single time to make sure that if something goes wrong on a particular day, then you just go back to the days before. And now you're only processing the transactions that occurred, in that 24-hour span, as opposed to trying to figure out which one of these files got lost in the translation.
My final question is there any physical copy that's maintained of the voter rolls outside of the actual poll books printed for Election Day?
We have physical copies for 2 years of the hard copies of the registration cards, as well as each voter record has a copy of the voter registration cards, and those are permanent retention until such time as somebody is no longer on the voter rolls. And then even when you're off the voter rolls, we still have a way to retrieve it.